I'm Lynn Preston,
I'm Elliott, Montgomery.
and we're going to have a conversation today about focusing and futuring.
Yeah, this will be interesting.
Yes, and we
Great.
don't know what we're going to say here, and that's part of the fun of it, is that we're going to see how a creative conversation can bring out our ideas in unexpected ways.
Yeah, we'll kind of improv on this one.
Yeah, right.
Great.
Well, I met Elliot at a very interesting event of the opening of a tiny little museum that had been an elevator shaft, and there was this big hubbub in this little street in downtown New York with bugles and,
Right.
and music.
Yeah, there was a full-on procession.
Balloons.
Yeah.
And everybody was waiting for this museum to open. And as we were waiting, you and I got into this conversation.
Yeah, we just started talking, and it seemed, curious that we were all there waiting for this thing to happen. We weren't sure exactly what we were going to see, but there was enough suspense that we were all just kind of in some positive mental state already. And so as we started talking, I think it was just a great time to meet a new person.
I became very intrigued with you because you said that what you did was help people to envision the far future, like 100 years from now. And you told me about a kind of installation where you had stopped people on the street corner and you said to them, what do you see around you? And these are just passersby, right?
Right. Yeah.
And what will be here in 100 years?
Right.
I thought that was fascinating.
Yeah, and it was funny to me because I think usually when I explain the futures-oriented work that I do, a lot of people are either kind of confused or dismissive. It is difficult work to crack the surface of, but once you get into it, it's actually really relevant to just about everybody. But yeah,
I was explaining to you when you asked me what I did, and I said something about focusing. That's also something that is difficult to crack the surface of, but is really applicable to everybody and everything.
I wasn't sure I totally understood it, but I was trying to put my finger on it. I felt like I needed to know more about this stuff. It sounded cool. Yeah.
Yes. So we're going to see what it is as we go along, and I'm going to see what futuring is, which I don't really.
Super. All right.
So why should people envision the future? What's important about that?
So the reason that I think more people need to be thinking about long-term futures is because we have right now a culture that asks us to think about or plan for the future, but rarely gives us tools or strategies for doing that. And so especially as we have more and more visions for the future coming from Hollywood, coming from political voices, and giving us these very tightly clustered visions of what the future can look like, it seems increasingly important, from my perspective, for us to branch out away from those narrow versions of the future and to start to postulate some alternatives to those that then we might use as kind of guideposts as we make decisions in the present.
So the vision of the future sort of guides us in terms of how we enter into next steps and things like that.
Yeah. A lot of people would argue that if you can't see a vision or a version of the future, it's really difficult to work toward that. You're working toward what you know. If you are thinking that the only profession in the world is a doctor, you're more likely to work toward becoming a doctor, go to medical school. You might never imagine going to school for a completely inverse profession.
Yeah, I remember you telling me how influential programs like Space Odyssey and Star Trek.
For sure, yeah.
gave people images that then really people sort of invented things like those images that were in
Absolutely.
those movies.
Yeah, yeah,
That
and there
was
are a lot of
fascinating
examples
to
of
me.
those, for sure. We kind of are constantly having our minds seeded with these visions of the future, and probably in some way in our subconscious, these seeded visions of the future just kind of lie there and they're waiting. And then when we take action, we probably are drawing on these visions whether we know it or not. And that may be an interesting point where focusing comes into play.
Yes,
right?
exactly.
Yeah.
Yes, this idea of something lying, although we would think of it not as really lying there, but just sort of emerging
Yeah.
out of our lived experience, out of our non-conscious bodily experience,
Right.
and
Right.
waiting to be articulated, or,
Mm-hmm.
or asking to be articulated even.
Certainly.
And, as you were saying that we're supposed to think of the future, but we don't have tools, I think parallelly,
Mm-hmm.
we're supposed to think more deeply, but we don't have tools. So
Right.
focusing is a kind of way of giving us tools to tap into what we're not aware that we're thinking. As one of my students said, what we know that we don't know that we know.
It's a brain twister.
Yes.
That's great.
Focusing helps us to get
Mm-hmm.
to get there,
Right.
to that.
That's interesting. I think part of the interest in identifying and then starting to put in practice some of these tools for futuring is that once we start to work with them, they actually feel really almost like second nature. They feel very immediate. They feel very natural. But until we have those languages or models in our minds, we don't know where to start. And so having a starting point seems like one of the most critical thresholds for people who are thinking about the future. Where do I go to do this? Or how do I get in? How do I break into it?
Yeah. And there's a parallel there with focusing also. That, creative thinking is natural. It's organic.
Yeah.
But people don't know where to start.
Right.
And then the tools for starting a process of creative thinking set something in motion, and then it feels very normal and regular to tap into what you didn't know that you knew.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think there are already researched understandings of the relationship between what our minds are able to do and the words that we have for doing those things. And I think that extends to the tools and the models. I think I was telling you about an anecdote that I experienced when I was traveling in Russia. And I was running a futures studies workshop with a group of folks who were living in Moscow. And I introduced a taxonomy for various possibilities of future. And so in future studies, sometimes we talk about the probable, the plausible, the possible, the impossible, and the preferable. And so as we lay out that range of varying futures, we can start to subjectively categorize the specific visions that we have. And so I introduced that model to a group of designers in Moscow, and they really had me back up and stop and say, we're not sure that we have this language that maps perfectly to the way you're describing it. And they said that it might be a cultural difference, that maybe the language that they use for thinking about the future is more focused. It's more specific on the level of a kind of a individual vision of the future as opposed to a pluralistic vision of the future. And so I think for me that just illustrated that oftentimes we do take for granted the terms or words that we use to talk about a specific concept, in this case the future, and when we realize that the words that we're using enable us to engage in a conversation, and without those words we wouldn't be having it, we realize the importance of adding to our vocabulary, or adding to our tool belt of models for doing work like this.
Yes, I totally agree. That relationship of language and thinking and creativity and what's possible.
Yeah.
It's possible as we find language for it, and the language opens up what hadn't been open.
Yeah.
And when something opens up without language, with what we call in focusing a felt sense,
Yeah.
just a feeling of it, but then we find some kind of representation, either an image or a metaphor or a poetic phrase that gives a handle for it, then we can think that.
Yeah. I think that term of that you used, the felt sense, is also really inspiring to me. In my field, I'm using design as a way to explicate or nuance the future visions that we're looking at. And so, it's one thing to tell someone about a future where we'll have a domestic robot in each home. It's another thing to design a fictional object that gives us a visual or a tactile sense of what it's like to live in that future. And I think that felt sense maybe, just kind of transcending the verbal narrative and going into a body or an embodied narrative is analog in focusing as well, right?
Yes, absolutely. In focusing, we would think about the edge of awareness being this, this sort of horizon of experience that we can then think from. And right at that edge, being below that edge, something is unconscious or unavailable.
Yeah.
And just at that edge is the area of metaphor and image. So it's like the image and the metaphor and the poetry helps to give birth to something that's right below the surface and bring it into a kind of linear sphere where we can think about it and bring it further.
Interesting. That's really fascinating. I think when you first mentioned this kind of cusp, you didn't use that word exactly,
that word, cusp.
The cusp of the conscious and the subconscious, and the ability for us to use focusing to kind of dip into the subconscious and traverse that cusp. I immediately started wondering if that would lead us into kind of tapping the existing visions of the future that have been coming to us from the Hollywoods, from the politics. But then I started thinking about a quote that is really commonly cited in the future studies world, which is that the future is all around us, it's just not equally distributed. Or the future
I love that.
The future is already here, it's just not equally distributed. And
I like that.
I think what's interesting about that quote in the context of what you're talking about, dipping into the subconscious, is that, it may be that, you see someone riding a hoverboard down the street, or one of these kind of weird mechanized scooters, and you think to yourself, that is the future. Maybe you don't even register that they go by you. Maybe it's just becoming part of your surroundings.
Yes.
And so then you start to think about the fact that this is a future. It's someone else's present, but it's your future, or it may not be the future that you want. And so alternately to, or kind of counter to these Hollywood futures that we're given, we have these living futures that are all around us, that we're hearing about and talking about, that could get closer to us, or we could be pushing them away. And then as we dip into our subconscious, we start to draw on all of the things around us that could be already here, just not equally distributed.
Yes. So they're here, but they're not thought yet by us. But
Right.
they're impacting us.
Exactly.
And we're impacting them, these little tendrils of futureness.
For sure.
And then we sort of notice, oh, look at this. Everybody's sitting around
Right.
in this restaurant with
Yeah.
texting each other.
Absolutely.
And look, how did that happen? And what does that mean?
Yeah. Or you go to, some countries in Africa and people are using a small mobile phone to do all of their banking. And then you come to the States and you look around and people are still like going to physical structures where, they have to interact with the teller. It's just, it almost feels like the future arrived for those people in a different way, maybe sooner than it did for people in another country.
Yes.
I think the same is true with many very curious technologies and commercial introductions in Japan, where you'll come across something like an all-black hamburger at McDonald's in Japan, and you would never dream to see that in a McDonald's in New York City. And so here it is. It's the future. It's just not here. It's there. It's maybe we hear about it or someone tells us about it, and then it drops into our subconscious.
Yes.
And then those cues maybe somehow come back out in later scenarios.
So I'm interested in you telling us more about the tools. What do you do in these workshops where you're having people envision the future? How do you get them into it?
There are a lot of tools that we use. We oftentimes start off more just with conversations about what our intentions could be as we think about long-term futures. I think there are multiple schools of thought around the role of the futurist, and one might argue that the futurist is one who predicts the future. I think that's a really difficult proposal for many people because it just feels impossible and maybe futile. And so the counter to that would be to suggest that the futurist is not predicting the future, but offering up calculated visions that we can work towards. So you're actually building the future by depicting it, by illustrating it.
Oh, I love that. Let me say that.
Yeah.
I have to say that to take that in.
I love it, yeah.
That you're building the future by depicting it, by visioning it.
Yeah. Using your imagination, which is, something that we all have. It's a human quality. And as you get more specific, more granular with that imagined possibility, you start to see where you might, how you might arrive at that scenario, that
vision. How you might enter it.
Exactly. Yeah, how you might make it.
Yeah,
or you might give
you're
birth
you're making the future every
that
moment.
Future. Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
So can you give us a specific example of a future vision?
Sure.
As this gong rings, the church bell across
appropriate
the
timing.
street, we're going to picture something together.
Yeah. One of the projects that I've come across recently is a project that a group of students of mine did at the New School. We challenged the students to think about a scenario where they might be able to deal with some of the critical issues around gridlock in the city and the problem that causes for mobility. And so the students started thinking about how in the future we might be able to deal with this issue of gridlock. They looked specifically at the notion that we have a massive amount of traffic in the morning and in the afternoon, these rush hour moments. And they said, all right, well, if everybody's traveling at the same time in the morning and then everybody's traveling again at the same time in the afternoon, is there a way to distribute the folks who are traveling at those times across a wider plane, a time plane? So they started thinking in this speculative way about possibilities that could be introduced to reframe our social kind of condition in which we all go to work at the same moment. And they proposed this version of the future that's meant to be a provocation. This version of the future suggests that we could have a New York City with 3 different time zones. And
Oh,
so
wow.
some people might have a time zone A that's pushed forward much earlier in the morning, and some people might be in a time zone B that maps to the one we know. Some people might be in a time zone C that's pushed later in the day. And so there's no flying car or new technology. This is a twist on a human construct, the notion of a time zone that would allow us to very simply flatten the peak moments of transit and distribute all the cars that are on the road. So we have more cars traveling through the city in the morning, more in the middle of the day, fewer at the current rush hours. And so now we have a new vision for the future. I don't think that the students envisioned us to directly implement the vision that they saw, but by portraying this vision and getting us thinking about this construct that we adhere to just because we've always had it, they are provoking us to challenge this way of thinking and to start to reimagine what might be possible as we look to the challenges of transportation engineering. So I think that's a great example.
Because then the people who like to eat early could go to one place, and the
Yeah.
people who like to eat late could go to another place.
Sure. Yeah.
I mean, it sounds like it would give a lot of fluidity and
Absolutely.
possibilities of coexisting in different universes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
The early
shake things
morning
up.
people would all move to this one area, and the late night people could move to the other area.
For sure, yeah, and imagine maximizing the early morning hours for those people who are already primed to wake up early. Their job starts 3 hours ahead of time, according to everybody else. Why shouldn't they?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I like
Absolutely.
that. I think it really helps to have a particular, example like that.
Yeah.
But now, give us a sense of the tools that you use to help the students to get to this.
Sure. So one of the things that we do with the students is to encourage them to focus on a specific question or event or issue, and then to start to imagine the implications that could take place based on that event. And then once they've imagined a handful of implications that are all relative to this initial event, we ask them to imagine the implications of the implications. And we do this a series of times. We use a diagram called the futures wheel. And so as you radiate away from that central node with a subset of implications and then a subset of those implications, it really challenges the mind to move away from the most predictable, expected possibilities, and to use your imagination, like we were saying before, to get into these versions or implications of what might come about that we would never arrive at if we just stopped at that first set.
Oh, I really like that. Yeah, so you're starting with something specific and then thinking into that.
Right. Yeah.
And then you come up with some possibilities. And then instead of stopping there, you think of the implications of each of those possibilities.
Exactly. Yeah.
And then you go further than that.
Mm-hmm.
And think of the implications of those implications. So each step is carrying you further from the predictable and what you packaged already.
And again, if we come back to this notion that we're not intending to predict, but we're intending to envision, and as we envision, we open up possibilities that maybe we hadn't seen before. There's no right or wrong set of implications or layers of implications. What's more important is that we tap into our imagination and creativity to arrive at these visions that may be desirable or may be undesirable, and by depicting them and becoming specific about how we think about them or talk about them, we're able to then put in place designs or artifacts or patterns for ourselves to use to navigate to or away from any of these specific visions.
Yeah, I really get that.
Yeah. So,
And that's very similar in a way to focusing on ideas, where you're in both cases encouraging people to enter into something freely,
okay,
and just see what comes up from that,
interesting.
and then follow it further, and see what comes up from those words or that feeling. I think what focusing adds to that is a kind of body sense of it. So
That's
when
interesting.
you're picturing these implications, you're picturing you're sensing into how those implications feel in your body. Everything that we imagine, everything that we think, has an actual physical, sensual living in
That's
our
great.
bodies
Yeah.
that has a lot to say. You know, like the example of somebody having an idea that makes you just cringe. It's like, oh,
Yeah.
or you know,
You don't even need to know what the idea is. It's the cringe that's
yes,
really
and then somebody
impactful.
else in the group will say something, and it's like, you could feel that. And if you pay attention to the physicality of the idea, of its impact on you, and then you ask into that and say, well, what is cringe the right word for that? And
Right.
what is that cringe? And
That's interesting.
what do I open to? There's all kinds of information that we already have, that we live from all the time, but we don't know we're living from it. We don't recognize the ways in which everything we do is really guided by this implicit knowing, this bodily knowing. We don't even know the next sentence, especially you and I,
Right.
that we're going to say.
Yeah.
And it has to come, and we can tap into that process of it coming.
Yeah.
And I liked what you said about it isn't so much the content of what we think of, but the process
Right.
of freeing that up. Yeah, the experience of it.
Yeah.
Of opening up the future. In focusing, it's often opening up the immediate future of a decision or
Right.
a situation or a relationship or maybe an idea. And in your field, it's opening up the distant future, which is recursive and comes back to this immediate
Absolutely.
process.
Yeah. And I like the idea that you're talking about, which proposes that we need to kind of question and investigate a bodily feeling, like cringing, for example, and not to write it off as purely a cringe, or simply a cringe, but to look at the specifics of that body feel and understand whether it was just a cringe or whether it had other tones
Yes.
that we can start to interpret, that give us a better sense of what our body was reacting to in that moment.
Yes. That's and the word cringe is a good one to use, because it's such a complex.
Right.
There's so much in that.
Yeah.
And it may be different for each person what's in it, but it's the coming together of a lot of different kinds of anticipations and past experiences and inclinations and values and intention. I mean, there's so much in that.
For sure. Yeah. Interesting. Well, this was a great conversation.
Yes, this was really, 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 really fun.
Yeah, it's really interesting to see the overlap space.
Let me show your book, which is a very intriguing book. That the physicality of the book says a lot about it. This feeling of a manual
We were really, so I worked on this book with a collaborator, Chris Wobkin. I run a practice with him, and we were really interested in taking everything that we've learned and trying to open source it and share these ideas and our experiences with others who want to start to work with these approaches and these tools. And so we've kind of set the book up so that you could pick this text up and then start to work with the tools almost as if it were a piece of machinery or a factory of your own. Our practice is called the extrapolation factory, and we use that metaphor a lot as kind of a system or a series of operations that yield something. But in this case, that something is a product of your imagination that's fueled by everything around you, including your subjective or your subconscious.
Yeah. And if people wanted to contact you, we can have a link.
For sure, yeah.
Yes.
Absolutely.
And what kind of things might they find in your extrapolation practice?
Well, the tool that I mentioned, the Futures Wheel, is in this book. That's a tool that we've picked up from others in the futures world. There are a number of other tools in here. I think there are 11 different tools that we talk about as we're introducing approaches to running futures-oriented workshops. But then we also are using the manual to tell some stories about how we've run workshops in the past and what we've learned from each of those workshops in terms of articulating visions through design, prototyping versions of the future, artifacts from the future, and enabling people to have experiences that represent some version of the future. So that's all in there, and hopefully we'll be able to see people picking this up and riffing on what we've done and making their own futures experiential by using this. So that's the goal.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. I love the combination of the emphasis on design and experience and future and imagination. It's these wonderful, juicy
there's a lot
ingredients. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sort of held together with design in some way.
Yeah, I think that's true, and that is in part because the two of us, Chris and myself, come from design backgrounds. So that's really the language that we had been speaking for years and years. And so as we were building future strategies into the work that we were doing, that felt like the beginning point.